So in terms of selecting assessment tools, one of the things, what we're going to do is go through the 10 tips we have for selecting assessment tools. I'm going to talk about each of those 10 tips in as much detail as I can in the limited amount of time that we have. I know an hour seems like a long time, but it's a pretty thorough topic. And one of the things that we want to do is kind of really frame in terms of right from selecting assessment is step one is to clarify your goals. So this is before we even get to selecting assessment tools or tests, what we're saying is, do we actually need to use a test or an assessment tool? So that's where we go with begin with the end in mind. For those of you that are really familiar with the work that Life Strategies does, we base so much of our work on begin with the end in mind, which is one of the 7 habits of highly effective people from Stephen Covey. And that really is, why do you want to do something? What's the purpose? What's your mandate? And do you actually need a test? So in terms of what is your mandate, think about why you might use a test, what your mandate is, what the goal is, in terms of, are you trying to create a resume with the client? Are you trying to do career planning with the client? And how does testing fit? And of course, we use this word client a lot, but when it comes to assessment tools, it's absolutely crucial that you figure out who the client actually is. And I know that might seem strange because you might say to yourself, just hold on a second, I'm just going to pause this for a minute. I've got a question from Liz that I don't understand. Talking about before our technical issue was who's the client? And I know in some cases you think that the client is the person sitting there across from you that you're working with one-on-one or perhaps in a group and that you're providing direct service to. And that's absolutely correct. That will be your client. But it's important to also think of who else might be your client. So in some cases it might be your funder. In some cases it might be an insurance agent that has referred a client to you for tests. So it depends on what your role is. And that's really important for selecting tools because it's also going to tell you who will have access to these results. If you're in private practice, for example, you're working with a client, the client is paying you for your services, then the client is going to own those assessment results. If you're working in a program that has funding where the funder, your oh, I can't remember the new title, they used to be project officers, has access to files, has access to client information, then what you do with the test results, perhaps even copies of the test, if they form part of a client file, then there's somebody else that has access to that information. If you're doing testing in the situation of, say, vocational rehabilitation, where you have a client that's referred from WorkSafe, British Columbia, or Workers' Compensation Board, then they also are going to have access to the assessment results, so they're also your client. So it's really important to think of the competing mandates and what the information that could arise from testing, who will have access to that. It's also really important to think of what do you hope to accomplish. What are you hoping the test is going to tell you? And is that information that you really need? Is that information that is really going to support you? And then how can you get there from here? So if you think about where you want to end up after testing, or at the end of your work with your client, or what this session is what's the goal of the session, and ask yourself from at that point, to get there, do I actually need to use a test or an assessment tool? And if you do, and there's lots of times where you do, where the test will be really helpful, then absolutely go ahead and use the assessment. But if you're not sure, then you might want to pause and reflect on whether the test, whether you really need to actually use a test. Okay, Lynn is still having some problems, and so I'm just going to have her phone Kathy. Okay, so that's that first step. Clarify your goals to ensure that and begin with the end in mind. And then the next thing that you need to do, and you can see we're not even selecting tests at this point, is you have to consider the implications of testing or not testing. So ask yourself, is there an advantage to using a standardized assessment tool? And a standardized assessment tool are going to be things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the strong interest inventory, the career decision-making system. There's thousands of tests on the market that are standardized, that have what we would call psychometric properties, that have been researched, and you need to decide whether there is an advantage to using that type of tool. You absolutely have to pay attention to cost-benefit ratio or return on investment. That's another way to look at it. You're going to have, in some cases, significant costs for using an assessment tool. As one example, for some reason, anytime you use an assessment tool that has the word leadership in it, it tends to be hundreds of dollars rather than 10 or 15 or even $30. So they seem to be more expensive. But you have to consider beyond what's the cost of the test. And that could include specialized training to be able to use the specific assessment tool that you want to add to your toolkit. It could include manuals, user guides, any of those sorts of things that you need to invest in. It could include, will absolutely include your time to administer the assessment. So there's all of these expenses to using tests in your practice, and you have to decide whether there's a benefit for that. Is ultimately using the test costing you more from a budget perspective, or is it giving you some savings? Is there good return on your investment? Are available tools culturally appropriate? Now, there's a couple of things about culturally appropriate tools. So one thing is that we're getting better with using or looking at assessment tools from a cultural perspective. But some of the older tests or tests that have had this strong foundation of research spanning several years will have likely started by being what's called normed against often first-year university students. And so they're not as culturally appropriate as we might want, especially if you're working with an Aboriginal population or an immigrant population, where it's very likely that the assessment tools that you have access to or that you're using in your practice have not actually been reviewed from a cultural standpoint, whether they're culturally appropriate. Now, in some cases, I might still use a test after I've decided that it actually isn't really a good fit from a cultural perspective. It depends on what I'm doing with my client, what results I'm looking for, what goals, and what my mandate is. So we have to, it's really important at this stage of the game when you're asking about or trying to figure out whether tools are culturally appropriate, that you have a really good look at the user manuals, the testing manuals, any of the research that's gone into the assessment, and we'll talk about research options in a little while and how you can do that. It's also a really, really good idea that you do the test yourself, especially if you're working with a cultural group that you have some expertise in. You'll be a very good judge of whether the assessment is culturally appropriate, and if it's not, whether it's still okay to do the assessment. Ask yourself, will the assessment help in decision making? In some cases, tests can provide really great information, thorough information very quickly. And in our time of not having a lot of time to meet with clients, assessment tools can be a fabulous way to really get to those goals or get to that end point. But in some cases, assessment tools might hinder the process more than they help. So one example of that might be assessment tools that have career suggestions at the end. We see this in, for example, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It's a personality assessment. They have what's called a career report, where as part of the report, they're suggesting possible occupations. And how they come up with that information is through a significant amount of research, and they're looking at people with that MBTI code, let's say an ISTJ, and where they most likely work. So where do they cluster? And what do they know about ISTJs and how they fit within various careers. But I've seen a lot of times that clients kind of grab onto that, and they get to feel that the jobs or the careers that are suggested in those reports are the only things that they should consider. And so then from a decision-making perspective, it's actually hindered your process because you almost have to undo what the test has done. You also need to ask yourself, are there any pre-post comparisons needed? So do you need to do an assessment now and then deliver some sort of service or intervention and then test afterwards? One of the, as I was thinking about this webinar, what came up for me doesn't really have to do with an assessment tool, but it's more like a typing test. You might want to do, if you have a client that needs to get into school or is looking to get into school and keyboarding is going to be an important skill, or perhaps looking at a job where keyboarding is an important skill, data entry, you might do a typing test or a keyboarding assessment and then give them some training or have them take some online programs to help improve their keyboarding skills, and then you're going to do a post and see what the improvement was. So that's a pretty generic example of a pre-post, but that's another place that a test can really help you. So point number 3, we're still not on selecting tests yet. Once you've clarified your goals and consider the implications of testing, then you have to really ask or look at whether to test or not to test. And in some cases, your decision is really going to be to not use an assessment tool. That perhaps the assessment tool is going to hinder your process, or you can't get a tool that is really going to work for you. Perhaps the tools that you have access to within your organization are really not culturally appropriate, and you're concerned about the harm that they will do for clients or whether the assessment results would be meaningful. Then the question, or then what you are deciding to do is actually to not test. And that's where the process of selecting an assessment tool would stop. You'd really just say, there's no test on the market that I as a practitioner can have access to that is going to give me the results that I need, and so therefore I'm not going to test, and I'm going to try and get that information that I'm looking for to help my client or to help me work with my client from a different, in a different way. So that might be through a structured interview. You might use some narrative approaches to surface the information you're looking for, because the test that you'd really like to use, you can't really use. So strategy number 4, or tip number 4, is determine budget. This is a huge thing to look at because, as I said earlier, tests can cost a significant amount of money. So some of the things to consider are your consumables, what we call your consumables. So those would be your test booklets and answer sheets, anything that when you use the assessment, you can't use it again. It's not reusable. So those would also be assessment codes for online tests. Then there's going to be your non-consumable items. So these are the things that you're going to be able to just add to your toolkit and use again and again and again. So those would be your qualification and or licensing fees. Those will be your manuals, your user guides, technical briefs, any research that you've gone in to support the test, the selection of the specific test, are all going to be your non-consumable items that are going to support or be part of your toolkit. And then, of course, there's your scoring keys and your software. If you have local software on your computer to score the test, that will be considered non-consumable. And every time you use the test, there's going to be a cost. In some cases, for non-consumable items, there can be a significant investment in scoring keys, in manuals, and in some cases in training, where you're investing thousands of dollars. And then what you're doing in terms of a budgetary perspective and that cost-benefit analysis or ratio, or that return on investment, is saying how many tests do I have to actually administer in order to pay back the investment that I'm making in some of these non-consumable items. You obviously have to ask yourself, do you have a budget? And what is your budget? In our assessment classes, we do an activity where we give students a scenario and we give them a budget, and they only have a limited amount of money to work with. Sometimes that's $15 a client, sometimes it's $5 a client, sometimes it's $50 a client. you have to be able to select your assessment with your budget in mind. You'll also have to, in some cases, think about whether you can pass on costs to clients. If you're in private practice, you're absolutely going to do that. In most cases, the services that we're providing within our agencies, the clients get access to the full range of services that we can offer for free, in which case you likely can't pass on costs to clients. But in some cases, you might want to say, why not? If there's a special assessment that I really think could help a client, is there the possibility of having the client contribute to that cost because there's a benefit to the client? And in some cases, there will be clients that will absolutely have the resources in order to do that if you can fit that in with your funding and your contractual obligations. The other thing from a cost perspective is there's going to be a cost for you to administer the assessment, or if you're not administering the assessment, an assistant administering the assessment. There's going to be time for you to review the assessment once it's complete, to understand the results. You're going to want to debrief that assessment with your client, and in some cases, depending on the reason for testing and or who your client is, you might have to write a report. And writing assessment reports can take hours and hours. So it's really important that when you're considering the cost, you're not just looking at, I've sat down and I've given my client a Myers-Briggs self-scorable and it was $15. That $15 is not the only cost that you're going to have. You really need to look at big picture. Now, if you're a full-time employee at an agency, you might not need to calculate your wages or your time as part of a cost, but you certainly have to look at the amount of time that you're allowed to spend with clients or that you have to spend with clients, and do you have the time to properly debrief the assessment to make sure that your client is leaving really understanding what the assessment tool, what information the assessment tool has surfaced, and does your client agree with what the assessment is saying. And if the client really doesn't agree, for whatever reason, do you have the time and the ability to really work through, was the assessment wrong? Because in some cases it will be. Or is the client, for whatever reason, not able to see or agree with the information that surfaced within the assessment, which also happens. So overall, when considering your cost perspective, it's crucial that you look at all of the costs. Tip or strategy number 5 is identify your special considerations. And one of the things to do is look at the considerations from your client's perspective. So you need to think about disability accommodation. Are you giving a client that is perhaps disabled in some way, perhaps has a visual disability? Can the client even really see the assessment? If it's an online assessment, can you zoom the screen to make sure that the client doesn't have any problem seeing the assessment? We've talked about culture. That's crucial. We've also talked about age. In some cases, you really need to consider the age of the client and the assessment that you're using. Grade level, every single standardized assessment, well, I say every single, and it really should be, but they'll let you know as the test consumer the grade level at which the test is written. Now, in Canada, we often see that tests are written at a grade 7, grade 8 level, but in some cases, there's certainly assessments that I could see practitioners in our work using that are written more at a grade 10 or even grade 12 level. So if literacy is a problem for your clients, you have to really look at what can you do to use that assessment, even though you might have some concerns around grade level, or is there a different assessment that you can use to make sure the language fits a bit better. Within that is also language proficiency and literacy level. And it's important to kind of tease these two apart. Somebody that is, for example, highly educated, we often see in our programs doctors, nurses, engineers, people with PhDs, but are new to Canada, and their English is poor, but they have high they would be considered to be very, very literate in their own language. That's a different issue, for lack of a better word, than somebody that is low literacy. So it's really important when you're using assessments to really consider your client and consider how the test is written. If you have clients that are truly low literacy, you need to identify an assessment that is written at a lower grade level, that has lower literacy. A low literacy assessment is likely not the best for an immigrant that is still learning English, but is a professional immigrant, and they could actually, low literacy is probably not the best. They actually need an assessment that is written without slang, without regionally specific words, without funny concepts or any of that. So you really need to play with some of these client considerations when looking at and selecting assessment tools. And part of this can be a challenge when we're working in quote-unquote one-stop shop centers where we're not really sure what type of client might be sitting across from us. And that's why it's really important to have a toolkit or a wide range of assessment tools available to you so that you can kind of pick and choose, knowing once you've learned about your client, once you've decided to test, then you can pull some of these considerations and say, even though I have this test in my toolkit, I know it's an appropriate test for my practice overall. Now you need to look at and ask yourself, for this particular client that's sitting in front of me today, is this test appropriate? And if it's not appropriate, perhaps you don't use it, or is it appropriate to use with some measure of accommodation? And so in some cases, it's simply giving a dictionary for any funny words, or being prepared to help a client get through some of the slang or those types of concepts that somebody that's relatively new to English might struggle with. Beyond client considerations, when client is the actual person taking the test, it's also important to think of ownership of results. So generally what I like to see is the client owns the result. The person that takes the test owns the result. And certainly when I was running career planning and job search programs for the federal and provincial government, the clients, we took note of any special things or any kind of high-level information that the assessment tool told us as part of our client file, but the actual copies of the test the clients took home, and that became their property. That's not always the case. I know that when we do work, for example, for WorkSafe BC or other insurers, they expect a full written report and copies of all of the assessment tests. So they get the actual Myers-Briggs or the actual Watson-Glaser critical thinking. They get an actual copy of the test. And that's just important because in some cases tests will surface information that perhaps a client doesn't want in a file, or perhaps doesn't seem on the surface to support a client's plan, but based on the battery of assessments, based on your discussions with the client, based on your expertise as an assessment specialist, you've worked through perhaps why somebody is doing a career or working towards a career that didn't come up on a career report as an example. Once that gets to another person or a funder, sometimes it can raise issues or questions. I've seen this several years ago when clients were preparing funding applications and the test didn't seem to support the funding application, and having to go back and forth with a funder to debrief the test with the funder to ensure that they really understood how we reached the conclusion of where the client is going to go, even though a particular test didn't seem to support that. So it's really important to look at all of these kind of special considerations as you're selecting your assessment tools. It's also really important to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. Just because a test worked really well for the last client does not mean it's going to work really well for the next client. So again, as I mentioned, it's really important that you have a selection of assessments that you have access to. And I don't mean kind of you're always going to do a personality test, so let's always use the Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is one personality test. I'm a fan of the Myers-Briggs, but it is not the be-all, end-all. And so I would like to have access to 3, 4, or 5 different personality assessments. And based on why I'm testing, the goals of my testing, if you think back to tip number 1, I may or may not choose to use a Myers-Briggs assessment. So other things to think about is, again, time. We can't get away from that time, and we can't get away from money. We have to think about those things. And the reality is, in our practice where funding is an absolute issue, sometimes we're going to choose a test just because it's a little bit cheaper. We have to think of the client need and the tools that are available. I really recommend taking a holistic approach. Really look at kind of all of the information that you're trying to learn and where will a test help you surface that information. It's often recommended that you do more than one test. So if I'm doing career planning with a client, I'm at minimum going to test or provide an assessment tool for skills, interests, values, and personal style. For any of you that's familiar with the wheel, that's the bottom half of the wheel. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I want to test for all 4 of those things, and I'm going to likely use a different assessment for each of those. But in some cases, for whatever reason, I might want to do 2 personality assessments. I might want to do 2 different interest assessments. I might want to do, a different type of skills assessment. So it's really important that you have lots of tools available so that you can kind of pick and choose rather than taking the approach of, regardless of who the client is, anybody that's doing career planning is going to do a Myers-Briggs and a strong interest inventory. And so you want to move beyond that. I can tell you from research that our team did in 2009 that it's actually very typical that agencies or career practitioners have a battery of tools that they always use, and they just always use them. And the Myers-Briggs and the Strong Interest Inventory or the Holland Self-Directed Search are very, very popular tools in our field. And so often we'll see people just using those tests just because they have access to them without really thinking, why am I using these tests? Do these tests actually still fit with my mandate, with the goals that I have for working with my client? Are they up to date? The other thing is making sure that as you're using tests for the purpose for which they were designed. And that takes us to tip number 7, which is all around research. Researching the tests that you're going to use so that you are really familiar with the test construction, with who they were, what groups of people they were normed against, with the validity and reliability information, and any other information that you might need to make an informed testing decision. In the research that we conducted in 2009, it became clear that some practitioners didn't really understand that a good test for one purpose does not necessarily mean a good test for another purpose. So as an example, and I really don't mean to pick on the Myers-Briggs, but it's a test that everybody knows, we saw the Myers-Briggs being used in practice to assess skills, to assess values, to assess a wide range of other things. The Myers-Briggs is a personality tool. It's designed, and its research was based on personality. It was based on the type, on Jungian theory, on personality type. It was not designed or researched to be a tool to assess somebody's values. There's absolutely going to be some correlation or some similarities between somebody that has, say, a Myers-Briggs code of ENFP and particular values that they might share with other ENFPs. So the information might not be wrong, but it's not what the Myers-Briggs was designed for. It's not on which it's probably 100 years of research was based on. So it's really important to really understand the research and the underlying foundation of the tool, the theoretical foundation of the tool before you use it, and only use the tool for the purpose for which it was designed. So in terms of research, there's tons of ways to find information, but it does take time. And that, again, brings up that issue that we've talked about in terms of not only time but also money. If you're going to use tests within your practice, it's so important that you take the time, which has a cost, to research the appropriate assessment. So things like talking to a psychometric specialist, somebody that uses tests all the time would be considered a testing expert. Get them on the phone or answering some emails or coming in to do some in-service so that you really get a solid foundation in terms of researching testing options. Publisher websites and assessment manuals are fabulous places to get some information, but keep in mind that they're likely going to be biased because the publisher's motivation and the publisher is interested in selling you a test. So they're going to really push that the test is fantastic, and it may very well be, but it's important to get that unbiased opinion. You can look at some research articles, textbooks and reference materials. Obviously, assessment courses, workshops, webinars such as this would be more unbiased reviews. I certainly have my favorites. I'm happy to talk about my favorites, but in no means, it doesn't mean that there aren't other tests that I might use. One of the things that we talk about in terms of assessing the quality of tests is not to be wooed by a slick marketing campaign. There's glossy promotional brochures. I've been to conference sessions with all of this fancy stuff that the presenter is talking about, and it's all designed for this marketing piece. And they may not provide all of the statistical information you need. In fact, in some cases, it can be very difficult to get the statistical information that you really need in order to make an informed choice on your test. And my personal recommendation would be that if you can't get the statistical information, proceed with caution or find another test, because there are lots of options. I'm a huge fan of Bureau's Institute of Mental Measurement. There's the web address is there on your screen, and we're going to send the PowerPoint so you'll have access to it. This is an independent test review organization. In lots of cases, there's a cost. It's between $12 and $20. It's not expensive, but it just gives you that independent, unbiased review of the assessment. One word of caution is I would make sure before you purchase any test reviews that you are purchasing the test review for the edition of the test or the latest revision of the test that you intend in using. So in some cases, for example, you might find that you want to use the latest edition of the Strong Interest Inventory, but the test review is for a previous version. You want to make sure that you're purchasing the review for the test that you're actually going to be using. And again, talk to an independent consultant that is not attached to a specific test or a specific publisher of tests, because they're going to be able to provide that independent review for you. And then it's really important to find the right tool for your purpose. Oh, there we go. So in terms of assessing skills, there's lots and lots of ways to do this. We often see card sorts such as the Motivated Skill Sort by Dick Modell, the Skill Scan tool, which is a card sort, or you can get it online. That's one of my personal favorites, is Skill Scan. There's also skills from an aptitude or general intelligence perspective, so basically an IQ test. There's also skills from an achievement perspective, and it's really important to know that aptitude and achievement are two different things. An achievement test is going to basically give you a grade level. It's going to be adjusted for how long the person has been out of school, whereas an aptitude test is really going to assess that big picture IQ. Does somebody have the ability to learn this? Were they going to take a class or enroll in school? And then we also put things like the emotional intelligence as a skill, because it's something that can be improved upon. It's really important that you assess for skills in a career decision-making perspective. You want to know what skills the client has. The reason that I like Skill Scan so much is because it also allows clients to sort their skills based on their desire or willingness to use those skills in their next job. Because sometimes we know from a career transition perspective or career decision-making perspective, clients may be ready for a change. They might have to make a change for whatever reason. Perhaps a sector has closed down in a community, so the clients have to move on. So it's important that a client is able to say, you know, I'm really good at blank, but I don't want to do that anymore. So they're honoring the skill and then setting it aside. It paints a more realistic picture than all of these skills that perhaps clients really can't get engaged in using anymore for whatever reason. In terms of interest, interestingly, within our field, within the research in our field, the articles in our field, interests are assessed for probably at least double of anything else. And we see that also in research articles. There's more articles and research information on assessing interest and on interest assessments than almost anything else. The Holland Self-Directed Search is a really, really popular tool in our field. We still see it being used. I don't have a problem with it. It's based on Holland's REASIC model. The caution that I would have for everybody is that the Canadian edition was last revised in 1994, so it is beyond old to be using, in my opinion. I think it's time to move on from the self-directed search unless you can get a newer version. The Career Decision-Making System is a great tool. It's available paper pencil. It's pretty cheap, and it's a nice tool. It's also Canadian. There's also the Career Exploration Inventory, the Career Directions Inventory. The Ashland is low literacy. I personally found it really hard to do the Ashland. I didn't understand some of the drawings. But it is designed for low literacy because it's more picture-based than word-based. The Strong Interest Inventory is another very, very popular tool in our field, and the Jackson Vocational Interest Survey. So those are just, they're not an exhaustive list by any means, but those are some interest assessments that we've certainly worked with that don't have a problem recommending other than the self-directed search, just because of its age. Assessing values, there's card sorts, things like planning on purpose cards, the values cards, there's surveys, the work motivation scale, the career value scale. The career value scale is online. The work motivation scale is pencil paper. And there's also some informal stuff. So one way to assess values is looking at corporate culture and looking at the mission, vision, values of an organization, or just engaging a client in a values-based activity. Values are some of those things that clients can have a hard time pinpointing, but we know from an HR perspective that we hire for skill and we fire for fit. And one of the things, or one of the places that fit comes into play really is values. So it's important that at minimum we're having a discussion around values when we're talking to clients about both job search and career decision making. And then, of course, there's assessing personal style. So we've looked at skills, interest, and values, and personal style, and now personal style. And as I mentioned earlier, if I'm doing career planning with a client, generally at minimum I would assess in these 4 areas, and I would have a specific assessment for each of these. So temperament is tools like personality dimensions, insights, true colors. Those are all temperament assessments. Then there's personality type, so this is based on Jungian theory. There's the Myers-Briggs type indicator. There's also the Majors personality type indicator, which is a relatively new tool. It gives you a Myers-Briggs type code, so the 16 codes are the same, but it approaches the assessment a bit differently. It's a tool that I quite like. And then there's also the 5-factor model, so the NEO suite of tools, and the 6-factor personality questionnaire. The 5-factor models are the 5-factor tools are based on the 5-factor models of personality. So it's coming at personality a bit differently. So personality dimensions is looking at temperament. Personality, or Myers-Briggs and the Majors is looking at personality type. The 6-factor is looking at personality from the 5-factor theoretical foundation or model of personality. So you can see that even assessing personality, you can get surface different information just by the type of tool that you're going to choose. And remember that choosing any one of these tools is just going to give you, it's like zooming in and seeing that somebody's got, you know, black eyeliner on today. And that's really all it's able to surface for you. People are pretty complicated, and so you know, not any one test or even battery of tests are going to surface all of this information that you might want to have. It's also really important to recognize that there are an incredible range of tests beyond basic career assessments that you might need or want to use in your practice or have available in your toolkit. So things like the rehabilitation or return to work readiness, things like occupational stress and trauma, issues requiring counseling referrals. If you have some of these assessments, say like, for example, the SA-45, if you've got a client that you really think needs a referral to counseling, you can use one of these assessments just to kind of confirm that and then refer the client on. And of course, things like the emotional intelligence, there's tests of critical thinking, there's tests for almost anything on the market. And so you want to look at not just the tools that you might use from a career perspective or a career intervention, but what tools are available beyond that kind of basic or foundational suite of tools that you might want to have in your practice. Where having a couple of these, in your offices might be helpful for you. You also have to determine the logistics. So testing considerations, how will you administer the assessment? Are you going to do it individually, which you can do, or are you going to do it in a group, which you absolutely can do? Is it going to be online or in person or some combination? If you're using online tools, can you ensure that the client has a quiet, reflective space, that the computer's not, say, in the middle of the reception area? Is there going to be an opportunity for the client to have some privacy while using the computer? Is the computer set up to be able to access the assessment site? And is the internet access going to be okay? Does the client need to be monitored? Are you going to do the assessments at your office or at another location? And that's really important because the goal of doing a test with a client is that the client actually does the test. And so in some cases you might need to do or arrange what's called proctoring. And that's where perhaps for whatever reason, the client isn't going to be able to do the assessment in your office, but can he or she go to the local library to make sure that the librarian would take the client's ID, set him or her up at a computer, and so that way you know that the client that you're working with is actually the client that has done the assessment. I don't find that it's a big issue when we're talking about career interventions or our work, but where we see it, where it's really important, for example, is in employee screening. So Life Strategies does some employee screening for various organizations, and the clients have to come into the office or the tests have to be proctored. The other thing in terms of how you administer the assessments, if you're going to work in groups, you have to think about confidentiality. So if you're administering, let's say, for example, a Myers-Briggs self-scorable within a group of 12 participants, at the end of each person individually figuring out their Myers-Briggs code, then all of a sudden you've got results. Are you going to, as a facilitator, ask each person for his or her Myers-Briggs code and then perhaps write it down on a flip chart paper? In essence, that can raise some issues around confidentiality because perhaps the client doesn't want to share what his or her MBTI code is for whatever reason. And so how are you going to handle those kinds of issues? What's the turnaround time for scoring or generating reports? Remember that if you use a system that is either online or requires scoring that is complicated enough that you can't sit and do the scoring while the client's there or the client can't self-score, there's going to be some turnaround time, and how are you going to manage that? And can the assessment plan be altered to accommodate emerging needs? So if an assessment, for example, validity scale indicates an inflated score or an inaccurate result, we sometimes call these lie detectors. Some standardized assessments have these lie detectors built in that will let you know whether you should trust the results of the assessment. And so there has to be a way to accommodate some of these things, whether in a group or working online, if they surface. And then the other thing, and the final strategy in terms of, or tip in terms of selecting assessment tools, is confirming the qualification level of your assessment specialist. It's really important to recognize that pretty much every standardized test is assigned an assessment level. And usually this comes from the publisher. So A level requires no specific training. Anybody can walk in, purchase the assessment, administer the assessment, read the report. This would include your client. B level requires graduate level education in test interpretation, psychometrics and measurement theory, or educational statistics, or specific training. In some cases, for many tests, you can get specific training where you can go for a 3 or 4 day course on how to use the Myers-Briggs, how to use the strong interest inventory. There's a lot of other assessments that have specific training available. They tend to be pretty expensive. Last I heard, I think the 3-day Myers-Briggs qualifying course was getting up to about $2,000, so it's a pretty significant investment. If you think back to determining your budget and deciding whether or not to test and that whole return on investment and cost ratio, if you want to incorporate the Myers-Briggs, then you're going to have to go and do $2,000 worth of training, and that's all it's going to certify you to do is the Myers-Briggs. You have to look at whether there's some opportunity for cost recovery. The other thing is, of course, if you have somebody that has a master's degree in your practice or has usually a bachelor's degree that it then has gone on and done specific graduate level courses, then they can use any B-level assessment. And so the nice thing about that is that though there can be, in some cases, a higher upfront cost, then the individual can really access any B-level assessment, including the assessments that perhaps do not have specific training available. So one that comes to mind for me is the occupational stress inventory. It's a very good assessment and measure of occupational stress, which we know that not only are we dealing with as practitioners, but clients are dealing with. It's a B-level tool, so you have to have this specific graduate level education. It does not have an associated specific or customized training course. So if you don't have B-level, you actually can't use it. And then C-level tests, generally the best thing to say is just that they require a PhD. But there's lots of people with PhDs that probably can't or shouldn't administer C-level tests because they really do require some very, very specialized training. So as you're looking at selecting assessments, it's important to think of the qualification level of yourself and of your staff, and so that you know what kind of tests you actually can draw from. If you don't have anybody that has their B-level qualification, then there's a whole suite of assessments that would be out of your reach, as an example. So if you wanted to use, for example, the Myers-Briggs, you're going to have to send somebody for the training, or perhaps you can make an arrangement with another local agency or with a testing consultant that when the Myers-Briggs needs to be administered to a particular client, somebody can come in and handle that for you. I've seen that happen quite successfully in lots and lots of communities. So just to review, we've run a little bit late maybe because of our technical challenges. So 10 tips for selecting assessments: clarifying your goals, consider the implications of testing or not, deciding to test or not to test. Those are crucial things before you even get to selecting a specific tool. You have to know your budget. You have to identify any special considerations. Is it culturally appropriate? What's the age level? What's the literacy level? It's really important to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. I know it's nice to say that every client that goes through your program is always going to do a Myers-Briggs, but it's important, and that might be okay, but it's important to have that flexibility to say when is that not going to be appropriate. You need to research your options. I would highly recommend that as part of your process for selecting assessments, in terms of this tip number 7, any assessment that you're going to give to a client, you must do yourself. If you take that approach, then you're going to be able to figure out a lot of these things around cultural appropriateness, language level. Is the scoring complicated? Is it giving meaningful results? Just by simply doing the assessment yourself. Obviously, you need to find the right tools for your purpose and look really broadly. Take that holistic approach so that you're trying to get at information from a number of different angles. Determine your logistics. Sometimes a test that you want to use, you can't figure out logistically, and so therefore you can't select it. And then confirm the qualification levels of your assessment specialist. So that, again, so that as you're researching and selecting your tools, you know from which pool of assessment tools that you can choose from. So that's our quick and 1 hour on selecting assessment tools. I'm just going to open it up to any